Hello, welcome to the Fennel Shed, and I'm delighted to have been invited to give a short demo here today on how to make a version of these Redwork stitcheries that I have been producing. This is a small number of the ones that I've produced over the years. Today I will be sharing with you a new version which will be very similar in shape and outline to this, but it's one that I've specially designed for this occasion, and it relates very specially to Christmas 2020. Now, we're ready to trace. Your pattern is printed out on paper, and you line that up, if you've got one, on your light box. You can tape it onto a window pane or onto a sheet of perspex or a plastic box and put your phone light underneath it, but if you do have a light box, it's the best way to do it. In the absence of a light box, put your traced pattern onto a light surface, work where you've got very good overhead light, and place your main fabric that is for your stitchery centered on. Now, by all means, use some sellotape to tape it down. I'm not going to do that because I'm only just doing this to show you the method, and I don't want to have it taped down. But when you're doing it, use sellotape or masking tape. Then take your tracing pen, and I'm going to use this micron pen just to show you. It's got a very, very fine nib. If you're right-handed, start up in the top left-hand corner. If you're left-handed, start in the other corner and work downwards and away from that corner so that your hand is never brushing against the piece that you've already traced. Once you have that all lined up, start at the corner and trace as carefully and as finely as possible. Remember what I said, every line that you make on your fabric has to be covered by stitches. So if you can do almost an implied line here and there, that will give you your very best result. And you continue what I'm doing there, tracing very, very carefully from the top left to the bottom right, or reverse that if you're left-handed, until you have all of your pattern step by step by step traced. On this pattern, as I mentioned earlier, there is some wording. That wording is totally optional. If you choose not to trace the wording, you can leave it out, or you can by all means add in some phrases or words or dates of your own. When you are preparing to trace, make sure you're tracing like me, where you can sit comfortably. Do not bend over a low surface. Do it with good light, and do it at a time of the day when you're not fatigued. It's very difficult to do this when you're tired. It's impossible to do it in poor light. So once you have that completed, your traced piece will look like this. Now, you won't be able to see how this is traced very, very lightly on the surface, but believe me, it's all the details are there, and they're so light they'll be very, very easy for me to cover with my embroidery thread when I start to stitch. So before I do that, I add on the interlining, and the interlining is this lovely light gauze, and you check, and it's got a side that is slightly shiny, and you center that onto the area where your actual stitching is going to be. It doesn't need to cover the full piece of cloth because we're going to trim this cloth eventually, and once you have that in place, then you can iron. And at this point you can use a little bit of steam, but only a little, and very, very carefully. And don't let your iron be too hot. If the iron is too hot, not only will it burn, it will prevent the sticking process. So once that's in place, allow it to cool for a few minutes, just to allow the adhesive to set. If you move it too soon, the adhesive will come loose. And if you wish to, you could pin or tack the sides or just the corners to make sure that that doesn't come loose. So once we have it at this stage traced and backlined with our interlining, then you're ready to proceed to the stitching. And now we're ready to sew. And every skein of embroidery thread like this has one long loose tail, which you can gently pull to take your length of thread. Your length of thread should be roughly from your index finger to your elbow and back. And you think, oh, that's very long, but we double the thread. And so sharp pair of scissors to snip it. Isolate one strand, just one, and peel the others off. Don't pull apart like this. Don't pull your threads apart. You peel those off, leaving you with one. This is very hard to do this all in camera, but it leaves you with one single thread, and the rest put to one side. Combine the two loose ends, which leaves you with a U-bend at the end, and those two loose ends you thread flat through the eye of your sharp needle. Now you've got a loop at the end of your thread, and that's essential. Get your thimble ready, decide where you're going to start. I'm going to start here. I put my needle through to mark myself on the back where I'm going to start. I take and draw it through slowly until there's just a little loop at the very end. Thread my thread through and closed. And that secures the end of my thread without a double stitch, without a knot, and without any long threads, because we really do want the back of this work to look almost as good as the front. And then one of the reasons that I designed this pattern is that the whole pattern can be worked in very straightforward stem stitch and back stitch. This is the one I call stem stitch, and it gives a lovely clear defined line, and it should look like a twisted rope. So your thread, you keep your thread secured here underneath the thumb of your left hand. Your needle goes forward the length of a full stitch and back to meet the point of the previous stitch and pull through. Not tight, but snug. Forward a full stitch, back a half stitch and pull through. Forward a full stitch, back a half stitch and pull through. And you can feel this raised surface like a rope, and if you look at the reverse of it, you should have a lovely neat little line of small stitches. So that's our first stitch, and I'm going to leave that for now because I want to show you the other stitch. And in order to do that, I'm going to repeat just one more time that exercise of isolating one strand, pulling off the excess thread all the way down the length of the strand so that it doesn't tangle. Join together your two cut length ends, and it will be a miracle if I get this threaded again. Yep, gone through. Because these embroidery needles, they have a very fine point, but it's long and slender, so if you can, you will be able to get the hang of putting your thread through. Now for the finer elements of this pattern, all of the main lines, the Christmas trees, the hills, the outline of the houses, they will all be done in the stem stitch. But every so often we want to do something much finer, like the little windows on the houses, for instance. So for those, I'm going to do a back stitch. And for now, that's the only two stitches that I'll show you. Later, I'll show you how to do the lettering and how to do very fine lines like the smoke coming out of the chimney and the stars. But the two essential stitches are what I'm going to do here on this first lesson. So again, I identify where I want to start my work. I loop through, slowly, slowly, catch the end. Ignore that, that's from the previous piece of work. And now I start my stitch at the end of where my first stitch is going to be, and this is to do back stitch, or some of the websites would call it outline stitch. So this is just a little square window, and anything that has a lot of angles and twists and turns, you're better to do back stitch than stem stitch, because stem stitch doesn't like to take a 90-degree turn. So I'm just going to do a couple of back stitches, and then I'm going to finish off for now with that, because those two stitches are going to be the essential stitches that you need for all of this stitchery. So a back stitch goes in at the front, and the stitch on the back is longer, and you pull that through, and then you literally go back on the top to the end of the previous stitch. So those are your two essential stitches, and that is my red work started. Okay, so now I'm going to show you in some more detail and up close how to do the various stitches. The stem stitch, that is the main outlines of the hills, the paths, the trees. The back stitch, that is the finer detail of the houses, the chimneys, the stars. And then the fine line back stitch with a single thread that does the wording, to make the wording nice and crisp and clear. And the wording, as I said, is the last line of a poem by Seamus Heaney. And that's the completed one. And here's another one that I'm working on. So I'm going to go back and demonstrate one more time just how you start with your thread. The thread has 6 strands, and you want to be able to extract one without creating a mess. So you isolate just one single strand. Take a hold of that, and with your other hand gently peel all 6, all the remaining 5 away along the full length, like that. Those 5 stay together. You keep those to use later. And now you've got one single strand which is the length from your index finger to your elbow and back, because now we double it. Don't be tempted to use anything any longer, because it gets frayed and it gets worn before you get to the end of using it. Then it'll tangle and knot and it'll be very difficult to deal with. So now I have doubled it. I have 2 raw edges here at the beginning, and I have like a little U loop at the bottom at the far end. And to thread it, I flatten these 2 threads nice and flat, because the embroidery needle has a lovely long slender eye, and that allows your 2 raw edges to go through nice and smooth. And now we want to place this loop exactly where we want to start to sew. So I've already done some of the main outlines, and I traced this in a very, very fine pale grey pigment pen, which you can't see. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I have re-outlined in a slightly heavier pen this word, one side of the Christmas tree, and just one little star. Now I'm going to begin with the stem stitch here on the Christmas tree, and I'm beginning here at the top of the Christmas tree. So I put the needle into the work exactly where I want to begin. At this point, the needle goes through, and you pull it out on the reverse, making a tiny mark to show you where you want to begin. And at that exact point, you take the tiniest stitch possible. Pull your thread right through until there's nothing left at the end but this little loop, and then you thread your needle through the loop and pull snug, but not too tight. If you pull tight on that, you could dislodge the whole thing. So now you have your thread anchored. You haven't had to tie a knot. You haven't had to do an ugly double stitch, and your thread is secure on the reverse. And we're ready to start doing stem stitch. The very first stem stitch is just a little half stitch. And you're always working like this with your needle coming back towards you. So just your initial short stitch. And then after that, the thread stays under your thumb. Your needle goes forward the length of a full stitch and comes back out at the end of the previous stitch. Pull through, snug. On the length of a full stitch, back a half stitch to the end of the previous stitch. Don't pull too tight or you'll get puckering. Just nice and snug. Keep this thread always under your thumb. If you prefer to keep your thread on the other side, that's okay, but whichever side you choose, stick with it. If you change from side to side, it's like walking in 2 different directions, and your stitching will not be even. The other thing to watch out for is when you bring this stitch back to meet the previous one, they should line up. If you leave gaps, if you were to take a big stitch and a short stitch back, you would have a very jagged line. So I'm just going to take 1 or 2 more stitches here, and this becomes a lovely easy habit, the stem stitch. Always taking the stitch towards yourself. And when you look on the back, you should have a little row of stitches that line up and meet. If there are big gaps, then you need to go back and adjust your stitch. So that's your basic stem stitch. Now I want to show you the other stitch, which is your back stitch. And for this purposes, I'm going to do the little star. So I have another needle threaded ready to go. And I choose again where I'm going to start on the star. And for back stitch, I always start sort of 1 stitch into a row, because you're going to be working back. That's where the stitch gets its name. So through to the back again, take a tiny stitch. This stitch really is just anchored into your back lining, but it means that you've got very few long threads on the reverse of your work here that you can see. The reverse should be almost as neat as the front. And now I bring my needle back through to the front, exactly on the marked line, because I want to cover the marked line. And now my stitch goes back to the starting point, And for this one, the long stitch is underneath the cloth and the shorter stitch is on top. And the advantage of this stitch is that you can turn very tight corners and you can place it very precisely. And it does give a finer line than the stem stitch. Stem stitch is almost like using bold in calligraphy. Now I can turn this very sharp angle at the point of the star with no difficulty in a back stitch, whereas with the stem stitch there's always an overlap and it would be very difficult to get a clean point on my star. So in with the needle, takes a double length stitch on the back and just the single stitch on the front, and you keep choosing where exactly to place your needle and planning where you're going to go in advance. So on out again to the point of the star. Now you'll notice I don't use a hoop, but a lot of people like to use an embroidery hoop, and if you do, by all means, if you find it helpful. I've just always done my embroidery. I'm self-taught, so I've always done my embroidery like this, just freehand without the hoop. I'm just going to take a couple more stitches here to show. Long stitch under the cloth, short stitch on top. Long underneath and short on top. And now you can see how these little back stitches line up to give you a lovely clear outline edge. And on the reverse you'll see you have far more thread on the back of back stitch than on the front, whereas with stem stitch you have far more thread on the surface than you will have on the reverse. And finally, the third thing that I want to show you is I'm going to do a little bit of the lettering, which is just carrying on from the star, because this also is done in back stitch, and for the same reason, because in lettering you have to be able to turn and twist with every twist of the letters, and you don't want something cumbersome. Now here we are, and we've only got a single thread, so I can't do a loop at the end. So what do? I leave the doing of the lettering until I've got some of the other framework in place. So I'm going to start here at the start of the word whole and the W. So I choose where I can anchor my thread into a neighbouring piece of work. So the nearest point to the start of the letter W, go through onto the reverse there and anchor in, just do an extra loop, and that stops that from fraying, but it doesn't create any density at the beginning of the letter itself. It's just a couple of stitches away and it leaves you with a clean start. So again, I want to place these stitches very, very precisely, because this is like writing with a fine line. It's only just one strand of thread, so it gives a lovely clear definition on the letters. So back stitch, we bring the thread up at the end of where our first stitch will be, and we go back to the start, take a double stitch underneath and pull through. Back again, through. Now you will have to place these stitches much more precisely and carefully than you need to do with stem stitch. You need to really identify where you want your needle to go in and where you want it to come back through the cloth again. So it's worth taking the time to place every single stitch. So I'm going to just keep going until I complete this letter W, because when I get to the end of the last part of this letter, I want to show you on the reverse how to tidy away your thread. So as I'm sewing, I'm always sort of watching out, where am I going to go next? And I choose with care where I'm going to start and plan where the thread will go before I finish. If my thread becomes frayed, I either trim the end if it's just the end that is tangled, or I finish off and take a fresh piece of thread, because sewing with thread that has become tangled is never going to be a success. So here I am going up the long side of this letter, all the way back to the top, placing every stitch with care. So that's that letter done. And you get a much cleaner line than you would ever get with a double thread. So always remember, for lettering, for numbers, for fine detail, go down to one thread. And now back onto the reverse. Pretend now that I'm at the end of a row and I want to tidy up again and finish off without leaving. Again, I take the thread to the nearest available anchoring point and I go through, create a loop, secure it with a very gentle knot, and then snip my thread about 1/4 inch out. And if you consistently keep tidying up as you go, you won't have threads pulling through onto the surface and ruining the nice crisp detail. So in a matter of just a couple of nights sewing, it's possible to complete a piece of this size. Add the frame as shown earlier and you've got your completed wall hanging. Now, to prepare the patchwork frame for your piece of Redwork, the easiest way that I've found to do it is this style here, which I've made from 6 assorted strips of fabric, 2.5 inch wide. So if you've got leftovers from jelly roll, that's perfect. So I have 6 different fabrics here, 2.5 inches wide by about 11 inches long. And I sew those together to create one unit like this, and making sure that you've got a nice range of colour and texture and size of print and so on. That then gets subcut into 4 even slices. Press it well and carefully cut it 2.5 inch wide slices. So you'll have 4 of these, and then those go in place 1, 2, 3 and 4 to create your frame very, very quickly and easily. And once those are in place, then you're ready to layer like a miniature quilt, your quilt sandwich, and to stitch it into place, and then finally add your binding. So now I've added a single fold binding. I don't use a double fold binding like we would on a quilt because it's too heavy. It's quite a light piece and a double fold binding is too clumpy for it. I've pinned the binding in place on all 4 sides, and at this stage I've added in my little hanging sleeve because it's secure here underneath the top edge, stitched in, and when the binding folds over it will contain that and enclose it and secure it. And then it's just a matter of hand sewing the bottom of my hanging sleeve and hand sewing all the way around the edge. When it's finished, then you can slot a fine dowel rod in across the top and have your wall hanging ready to hang.